Thank you very, very much to Amma. I've got a great, great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Simon Fujiwara, who's a UK-Japanese artist and writer whose practice encompasses short stories, performance, live music installation, and sculpture. He bridges the gap between all of this. His work has been exhibited internationally in the 53rd Venice Biennale, at Manifesta 8, here at the Frieze Projects, and also most recently at the Sao Paulo Biennale, where actually he shows the personal effects of Theo Grünberg, and that is a project which is very, very related to the context here, the Royal Geographic Society. He's also this year's winner of the Cartier Award and the Baloise Art Prize, and is nominated for the Future Generation Art Prize in Kiev. Now, we've got no idea, because it's a secret, what Simon will do here today as part of the marathon. He has sent me a letter a couple of weeks ago, which had some hints. A very warm welcome to Simon Fujiwara.
Thank you, Hans. Some of you might have been to Regent's Park this week, because there's something quite extraordinary happening there. An incredible discovery, a 2,000-year-old Roman city has been discovered underneath the Frieze Art Fair, the park. Now, I've been very privileged to be part of the archaeological team that has been excavating this this incredible civilization over the past 5 weeks, but unfortunately, over the last week, the Frieze Art Fair, an annual event that brings together art and commerce, has been interrupting the archaeological excavations. And I'd just like to preface this by urging you to all go back next week when the Frieze Art Fair is gone, and to see the extent of the full city. The extraordinary thing which you can see in this map is that the frozen city, the archaeologists have called it, is pretty much the same size as the Frieze Art Fair, leading archaeologists to believe that the Frieze Art Fair is almost a site-specific project, that it was built knowing it was standing on the ruins of this civilization, a civilization that dealt specifically in art and commerce. There are a lot of also other coincidences, which is that the entrance to the city is pretty much exactly where the entrance to the Frieze Art Fair is, and I'll be taking you through a short guide of this city today. Now, this is a map of Regent's Park. We can see here that the Frieze Art Fair stands very lightly on the park. It's a temporal thing, like a butterfly. It comes and it goes every year. And here we see the frozen city just slightly larger underneath. Now, this is a timeline of the frozen city, and it gives you an idea of the dates. AD 43 is when the Romans invaded Britain, and archaeologists really don't know much about this period, and so a lot of the city is based on speculation. We see the fall of Pompeii in AD 79, Pompeii being incredibly important to the frozen city because a lot of the artifacts we've found there are very similar to those that were salvaged from that period. We see the golden age of the frozen city is this period, between AD 110 and 190, and then suddenly a very dramatic fall of the city at the turn of AD 200. Why is this? We don't know, but we speculate that it might have something to do with the emergence of Christianity in Britain. This is a mosaic discovered, and that because this city was so incredibly debauched, it had such an incredibly materialistic culture, that perhaps when Christianity emerged, it couldn't be tolerated anymore. Here's a map of the frozen city again, as it appears underneath the Frieze Art Fair. And these are the 6 excavations that the Frieze team have been very kind to allow the public to actually view, and have even gone as far as paying for 6 glazed viewing floors. This is the first of them. It's at the entrance of the Frieze Art Fair. We see the red carpet where people would be walking in. It's an incredibly large piece, 6 meters long, and this was the frieze of the city gates. Now we see here a very elaborate mural painted, and we see on the right people arriving at the frozen city disheveled with their arms outstretched. We see people leaving in a debaucherous state, wearing much less than they were when they arrived, and slaves carrying artworks onto the boat. we also see here the most important symbol that tells us that this was a really market-driven city, the Macellum, or the Roman art market, visible through the city gate. And here, very importantly, these faded theatre masks. Now, no theatre was discovered in the frozen city, which is extraordinary, because every Roman city had a theatre. And this has led archaeologists to speculate that perhaps just by passing through these gates, visitors, were entering a city that was theatre itself. They were performing in their own daily lives, and that the commodities became like props. Here we see the incredible scale of the frozen city. Just the fragment that's been excavated as part of this 9-meter tall gate. Now, what's the first thing that the visitors want to do when they arrive at the city? Well, they of course can't concentrate on shopping just yet. They have to please their bodily desires. And one of the first excavations that we found was in the pleasure district, the House of Pleasure, or commonly known as the Roman brothel. Here we see part of the excavation. Extraordinary, nothing quite like this has been discovered. Here we see these sculptures with enlarged phalluses. One, unfortunately, has been broken off, but we are trying to reinstate it. And we can see in this image just the tiny fragment we've uncovered of an incredibly elaborate backroom brothel, incredibly debauched, as you're going to see in the next slide. Here we see the erotic murals in the Pompeii style, but never have we seen bisexual, multi-part orgies in this manner. Here we see a gladiatorial helmet. Now, this is incredibly curious because archaeologists believe they were uncovering an amphitheatre. It was on looking closely at these spikes that archaeologists realized that would never be used in battle. You don't want anything that's going to bring you down. And this points to the incredible sophistication of this culture, that they were wearing items of their own blood sports as part of this elaborate sexual role play. They were parodying their own culture already in this time. We see here perhaps the most raunchy aspect is one of these iron hoops. This has led archaeologists to understand that people would actually use these to hold onto whilst they lowered themselves onto these enlarged phallus caryatid sculptures. Now, this is obviously rather a lot of information I'm giving you, but it serves the point of explaining that people didn't come to the frozen city, the brothels of the frozen city, to copulate with humans. They came to copulate with sculpture. A very small detail before I move you on is that this excavation has been painstaking because of the large layer of concrete that was filled in that has been dated to the end of the Victorian era. Further chemical tests of the interior have proven that Victorians actually have discovered this before, that the whole city was known about, but hidden under this layer of concrete because it was deemed too dangerous for the public at large. But of course, before it was hidden, it was used once or twice. Now we come to the most important part. This is a spiritual and commercial center of the frozen city, and that's the Macellum. Now we're showing here the red section is just a tiny excavation we've been able to do, but what we would be discovering here. Now, we didn't discover any guttering in this market, which leads us to believe there was no meat sold here. No food was sold. We discovered 15 bronze hands, which we now believe are the hands of the artist, that these were godlike statuettes, reliquaries, that people would come from all over the world to buy. And in the absence of Christianity, that perhaps the artist in this city was God. But because there were so many of them, perhaps artists already in the 1st century AD were part of a large system of commodification. Here we see a view of the market as it's been excavated in the process. And here we see some of the shots of the excavation. Frieze have been incredible, giving us this prime real estate within their fair to allow us to continue this. Now, the mosaic on the floor is rather sinister. You see, this is a replica here, a swastika pattern. Now, swastikas are incredibly common in the Roman Empire, and they signify a perpetual change, appropriate for a market floor. But it wasn't until we, in the process of uncovering it, we discovered this child's sock, wartime newspapers, and we started to realize that for decades, wartime Blitz-era items were sitting just centimeters above this mosaic, and that this was a kind of Roman premonition, perhaps, of impending tragedy in Europe. It's a chilling thought, I think you'll agree. Now I'm going to whip through some of the rest of the excavations and introduce you some of the characters of the frozen city. Here we have the female patron. She's met a rather gruesome end, as you can see, with a shoe stuffed in her mouth, along with a Roman pearl necklace, which has been remarkably preserved. Here we see a prayer niche in her home, holding yet another one of these artists' hands, and we see some of her personal effects, including the bronze jewellery, ear-cleaning bone instruments, and a comb. Lots of money as well. Now, women ruled the frozen city. This is what was so extraordinary about it. It was a liberal society, very much ahead of its times, and perhaps even ahead of our times in this sense. And archaeologists have a really split feeling when they look at this, because on one level, of course, it was such a debauched society, it had to end in some senses, but there's a melancholy about the fact that, you know, it was getting to some point of a liberal state beyond what even we may know today. Here we see a replica of that shoe. It clearly wasn't a natural death. And unfortunately, this is one of the excavations that has been most difficult and painstaking to uncover, largely due to the 1930s sewage system that has been running through it, as we can see here. Very briefly, we come to the what archaeologists are calling the Carnivore Cafe. Incredibly, this has just been uncovered right next to the Frieze Art Fair restaurant, which just sits here. It's been proving very difficult as shippers come in. But archaeologists were really believing that they were discovering an ancient burial site here because of the number of bones that were found in this excavation. But as they dug deeper, they found frying pans and pots, and also oyster shells and spoons. But they were not only animal bones, they were human bones in this, and archaeologists have been dreading the conclusion that perhaps the ultimate symbol of decadence in this city was also the ultimate taboo, cannibalism, a luxury, they say, to die for. And now we reach the outskirts of the city. This is the last of the 6 excavations. It's the dead artist, again an unnatural death. Here we see him with a knife through his mouth. 500 Roman coins, an incredibly wealthy artist. The artist, we believe, was about 28 years old. We see here some of his tools, his implements here. And what really astonishes us is that in Roman times, we've never discovered artists. Craftsmen, artisans are well documented, but artists with their own unique individual style, as we know them today, weren't thought to exist. How do we know he was an artist? Well, in the neighbouring dig, we found a number, 6 in total, portraits painted on stone slabs, self-portraits, which make us understand that not only was this an artist, it was an autobiographical artist working with his own image. Quite extraordinary. This is an image of the artist. He is part Asian, we believe, which again further underlines the multicultural, advanced society. Perhaps they were trading already with China. China, we know in the 1st century AD, was a rising superpower and growing with its vases and all sorts of things that it was trading. Now, to finish, there's a lot of speculation. Was it murder or was it suicide? Well, the murder theorists believe perhaps this young, wealthy artist was killed by jealous artists in his circle. Perhaps he was even killed by a patron that he didn't need anymore, that he made more money than the patrons. It's an interesting thought, but there's a new theme of archaeology called psychoarchaeology. It's a marriage of psychology and archaeology, and they believe that maybe he committed suicide, that the narcissistic, repetitive process of his work, driven by this market-fueled economy to constantly replicate his own image, led him to suicide, not to mention in the comfort of his wealth. But then there's also the very last theory, which is that perhaps this was considered an artwork, and perhaps it was the artist's very last performance. Thank you.